What if the biggest financial mistake of your career suddenly became your best option? Just a few years ago, airlines were retiring the A380, calling it uneconomical, outdated, and impossible to justify. Some parked entire fleets in the desert and promised they'd never fly again. Today, many of those same airlines are spending hundreds of millions of dollars bringing them back. So what changed? Is the A380's comeback real, or is the aviation industry simply running out of alternatives? The answer is far more surprising than most people realize.
To understand why the A380 exists at all, you need to go back to the late 1980s, because the story of this aircraft doesn't start with an engineering brief. It starts with a rivalry. By the late 1980s, Airbus had been building competitive commercial aircraft for over a decade. The A320 was a genuine hit. The A300 had found its customers. Airbus, by any reasonable measure, was a serious player. But there was one aircraft they simply could not touch: the Boeing 747. The 747 wasn't just a plane, it was a symbol. The hump, the size, the idea that you could put nearly 400 people into a single aircraft and fly them across an ocean. It had become shorthand for what modern aviation was. For Boeing, it was the crown jewel of the entire product lineup. And for Airbus, not having anything like it was starting to feel less like a gap in their portfolio and more like a statement about who was really in charge of this industry. Richard Abulafia, one of the most respected voices in aerospace consulting, had a name for what Airbus was experiencing at this point. He called it fuselage envy. And while that phrase sounds almost comic, it describes something very real. Airbus leadership had become genuinely enchanted with the idea of building something larger than the 747, not purely because the market demanded it, but because doing so would prove, once and for all, that Airbus could out-engineer Boeing on Boeing's own terms. Now, at the same time this ambition was quietly fermenting inside Airbus, both manufacturers were also wrestling with a very real question about where aviation was headed. The Iran-Iraq War had made it painfully clear that operating four-engine aircraft like the 747 on long-haul routes was expensive and fragile when fuel prices spiked. And turbofan engine technology had advanced enough that for the first time, regulators were beginning to allow twin-engine aircraft to cross oceans, something that had previously been unthinkable. Boeing looked at all of this and reached one conclusion: the future was point-to-point. Smaller, efficient twin-engine aircraft connecting more cities directly. Fewer massive hub airports funneling everyone through the same 3 or 4 choke points. More flexibility, more frequency, less waiting in Dubai for a connection. That philosophy would eventually produce aircraft like the Boeing 777 and years later the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Both were built around the idea that passengers increasingly preferred flying directly between cities rather than connecting through giant hubs. Airbus looked at the same data and reached almost the opposite conclusion. Their projections showed global air travel growing so fast over the coming decades that existing airport infrastructure simply could not expand quickly enough. Runways are finite, landing slots are finite. The solution, in Airbus's view, wasn't more flights, it was bigger flights. Concentrate more passengers onto fewer aircraft. Move 500 people at once instead of 250. Let the hubs do what hubs do best. Both of those positions were reasonable, genuinely reasonable. The problem was that Airbus also had that other motivation underneath the surface: the 747 rivalry, the engineering pride. And when you mix rational market analysis with corporate ego, you don't always get the most objective conclusions. And then Boeing did something clever. In the early 1990s, Boeing approached Airbus with an unusual proposal: a joint market research study to evaluate the viability of ultra-high capacity aircraft. On paper, it was framed as a neutral shared investment in understanding the market. In practice, as several analysts later concluded, it was Boeing probing how serious Airbus really was about building a 747 and quietly gathering intelligence on what it would be competing against. Airbus agreed. The study ran for a while. It eventually concluded, predictably enough, that the economics of a new four-engine widebody were extremely difficult to justify. Boeing withdrew, having learned what it needed to know. Airbus, however, was already too deep in. The money had been spent. The internal planning was underway. The prestige of the project had become its own gravitational force. In the year 2000, Airbus formally launched the A380 program. Forbes later described it pointedly: the very existence of the A380 was a product of Boeing cleverly taking advantage of Airbus's ambition. Whether you think that's fair or slightly harsh, what's undeniable is this: the aircraft that would become the world's largest commercial passenger jet was born as much from competitive psychology as from market necessity. And that matters, because it shaped every decision that followed.
Designing a new commercial aircraft is one of the most expensive and complex things a company can attempt. Designing one at this scale, a full double-decker, 73 meters long, a wingspan of nearly 80 meters, capable of carrying over 500 passengers, placed it in a category that had never existed before. Airbus went into the program with a development budget of approximately $10 billion. To break even, they needed to sell around 270 aircraft at their target margins. Both of those numbers would turn out to be badly wrong. The A380 was built across 4 countries. Wings came from the UK. Fuselage sections arrived from Germany, France, and Spain. Everything then had to travel to Toulouse, France for final assembly, sections arriving by ship to the port of Bordeaux, then moving by river barge and specially modified road convoys along routes that had been physically widened just to accommodate them. Inside each completed aircraft sat 530 kilometers of electrical wiring, 98,000 individual wires, 40,000 connectors. It was, at the time, the most complex electrical system ever installed in a commercial aircraft. And this is where things went catastrophically wrong. The French and British facilities were running a newer version of Airbus's internal design software. The German and Spanish facilities were running an older version. When the wiring harness design files were transferred between these systems, the 2 versions failed to communicate correctly. The files looked fine on screen. The engineers signed off. The sections were shipped. And then, in Toulouse, when workers began the physical process of installing the wiring, they discovered that the harnesses, already manufactured, already shipped across Europe, were too short by centimeters, not meters, centimeters. Pause. Let that land. 530 kilometers of electrical wiring running through the world's largest commercial aircraft, and it couldn't reach its connectors. Over 1,000 German engineers were eventually dispatched to Toulouse to attempt a manual rework. It became clear fairly quickly that patching wasn't going to work. The entire electrical system, across multiple aircraft already deep in production, had to be stripped out, redesigned from scratch, and reinstalled. In mid-2006, while Boeing was making steady progress on the 787, Airbus made its first public admission of delays. 6 months, they said. It'll be 6 months. Then another announcement. Then another. By the end of that year, the cumulative delay had reached nearly 2 years. The projected earnings shortfall by 2010, approximately $5.6 billion. FedEx and UPS, who each ordered 10 A380 freighter variants, exercised their right to cancel. The freighter version of the aircraft was quietly killed before the passenger version had even carried its first paying customer, eliminating what could have been a crucial secondary revenue stream. Airbus shares fell 26% in a single day. The CEO resigned. When Airbus revised its break-even calculation after absorbing all of this, the number had climbed from 270 aircraft to 420 aircraft, and total development costs had blown past $25 billion. The aircraft hadn't flown a single commercial route yet, and it was already becoming one of the most expensive commercial aviation programs ever undertaken. In October 2007, the Airbus A380 finally entered commercial service with Singapore Airlines as its launch customer. And here's the thing, and this part is important. The aircraft was genuinely, legitimately magnificent. Passengers who flew it immediately noticed something unusual. Even at cruise altitude, it was quieter than any wide-body they'd been on before. The dual-deck design meant that interior noise was distributed differently, vibration was reduced, and the sheer mass of the airframe absorbed turbulence in a way smaller aircraft simply couldn't. Attendants described walking the upper deck during a transatlantic flight as feeling almost surreal. The calm, the space, the sense that you were genuinely somewhere. The engineering, in almost every passenger-facing dimension, was extraordinary. Commercially, however, the picture that was emerging was deeply uncomfortable. Across the entire global airline industry, every major carrier on Earth, just 14 airlines ever placed orders for the A380. Total orders reached 251 aircraft, far short of the 420 needed to break even. And of those 251 aircraft, nearly half were ordered by a single airline, Emirates. We'll come back to why that matters in a moment, because it's actually the key to understanding whether the comeback we're seeing right now is real or not. First, let's talk about something that's easy to overlook but reveals a lot about the aircraft's fundamental limitations. Not a single American airline ever bought the A380, not one. I'm curious, if you had the choice between flying on an A380, a 747, or a modern 787 tomorrow, which one would you pick and why? Let me know in the comments. This wasn't accidental, and it wasn't about national pride or Boeing loyalty. It was structural. The A380's wingspan of nearly 80 meters means airports need widened runways, enlarged taxiways, reinforced gates, and dual jet bridges just to handle it. While large U.S. hub airports like JFK and LAX technically have the footprint, the American aviation model is built differently from European and Middle Eastern hubs. Delta, United, and American each operate out of multiple hub airports distributed across a continent-sized country. Their networks are built around frequency and flexibility, many flights connecting many cities, not massive concentrations of passengers on a small number of routes. The A380 would have been too big for off-peak departures, too inflexible for route adjustments, and too expensive to keep profitable on the routes where it might actually fill up. When the Boeing 777 and then the 787 arrived, twin-engine, fuel-efficient, profitable on moderate passenger volumes, the American case against the A380 became completely airtight. They looked at the economics and never looked back. If you're enjoying the story so far, dropping a like is one of the easiest ways to help more aviation fans discover videos like this, and it genuinely helps the channel more than you might think.
Here's the fundamental tension at the heart of the A380's commercial story, and once you understand it, everything else makes sense. The aircraft delivers genuinely attractive economics when it's full. When every seat is occupied and the load factor is near maximum, the cost per passenger per kilometer is competitive with anything else in the sky. The problem is that filling 500-plus seats consistently across an entire year on the same route is extraordinarily difficult. Qantas ran the numbers on one of its own A380 routes, Sydney to Los Angeles, and the results were stark. A single A380 flight on that route cost the airline approximately $300,000 to operate. The same route on a Boeing 787 cost $190,000. The A380 carries about 34% more passengers than the 787, but it costs 60% more to fly the same distance. Think about what that means in practice. You need to sell significantly more than 34% extra tickets at full price just to break even compared to running a smaller aircraft. And that's before you account for any empty seats, any discounted fares, any off-peak periods. Seasonality made this even worse. Air travel is genuinely seasonal. Demand peaks sharply during Northern Hemisphere summer, certain holidays, school breaks. It collapses through winter on most leisure routes. On those quiet months, airlines were flying an enormously expensive aircraft at 65 to 70% load factors and watching the economics turn negative almost in real time. The only carrier that seemed largely immune to this problem was Emirates. And here's why that matters so much. Emirates isn't a normal airline. It's an airline that grew up around a specific hub model with a single mega hub in Dubai, positioned almost perfectly between Europe and Asia, between East Africa and North America, between the Indian subcontinent and Australia. Passenger volumes through Dubai are remarkably consistent year-round because Emirates draws travelers from so many different origin markets simultaneously. When you run that kind of network, filling a 500-seat aircraft isn't aspirational, it's routine. For almost everyone else, Air France running seasonal leisure routes, Lufthansa competing on thin-margin business routes, Qantas managing one of the longest routes in the world, the A380's economics were a constant negotiation with a machine that only wanted to be full. And then, in early 2020, the pandemic arrived. Within weeks, approximately 90% of the world's A380 fleet was grounded. That statistic sounds dramatic because it is, but it also reveals something true about the aircraft. It had the least margin for disruption of any wide-body in the sky. Any aircraft dependent on consistently high demand suffers when demand collapses, but the A380 had no buffer. It was full or it was hemorrhaging money, and suddenly, globally, there were no passengers at all. Several airlines made what seemed at the time like a permanent decision. The A380 was retired. Not stored, not paused, retired. The books were closed. Qatar Airlines CEO Akbar Al-Baker, who had already publicly called the A380 purchase one of his airline's biggest mistakes in 2019, announced early retirement of the type. Air France followed, Lufthansa followed, Singapore Airlines followed. And the consensus among aviation analysts in early 2020 was near universal. The A380 would never meaningfully return to commercial service. The economics were broken, the timing was catastrophic, and better aircraft were finally on the way. That consensus, as it turned out, was spectacularly wrong.
When international travel demand came back after the pandemic, it came back fast, faster than almost any model had predicted. Airlines that had built conservative recovery forecasts, that had right-sized their fleet for a gradual return, suddenly found themselves with a serious problem. Not enough seats. Not enough large, wide-body aircraft. Not enough capacity on the most commercially important long-haul routes. The transatlantic, the Europe-Asia corridors, the routes where premium passengers travel in volume and where yield per seat is highest. Airlines that had retired their biggest aircraft to cut costs during the pandemic were now scrambling to add back capacity with no quick way to do it. New aircraft take years to deliver. Pilots need retraining. Maintenance certifications need reinstating. Qantas made the decision to bring its entire A380 fleet back into service. The cost? Approximately $400 million and 100,000 man-hours of maintenance work for an aircraft type the airline had essentially written off 2 years earlier. Lufthansa, which had formally retired its A380 fleet during the pandemic, reversed course and began the return-to-service process. And Qatar Airways, whose CEO had publicly, memorably called the A380 purchase one of the airline's biggest mistakes, began quietly returning the aircraft to operation. What changed? Three things, and they're connected in ways that matter. The first was demand, but not just the volume of it, the type. Post-pandemic travel didn't just recover, it recovered with a notable shift toward premium. Passengers who'd been unable to travel for 2 years were returning with more willingness to spend. Corporate travel, which had been declared dead by many analysts during the pandemic, came back more resilient than expected. And critically, the demographic of high-value travelers, people spending $3,000, $5,000, $8,000 on a business or first-class seat, kept growing. Airlines suddenly looked at the A380's enormous interior volume differently. Because here's something the original critics never fully appreciated. The A380 isn't just big in a passenger sense, it's big in a space sense. And space in premium aviation is currency. A Boeing 787 or an Airbus A380 is an excellent aircraft, but there are physical limits to how much premium real estate you can install in a fuselage that's roughly 6 meters wide. The A380's main deck is nearly 7 meters wide, and the upper deck adds an entirely separate usable cabin. Airlines began to realize they could configure premium products in an A380 that simply couldn't exist on a Boeing 787. More first-class suites, wider business-class pods, separate cabin zones that preserved the quiet experience passengers had always associated with the upper deck. Emirates' announcement of a retrofit program worth around $2 billion, covering 120 aircraft, most of them A380s, is the clearest expression of this logic in the industry. You don't spend $2 billion on temporary. Emirates is betting that premium demand will sustain the A380's economics for at least another decade, and they're reconfiguring the entire fleet around that bet. If you haven't subscribed yet, look, I'm not going to pretend the algorithm doesn't matter, because it does. But more than that, if you're 15 minutes into a video about aircraft economics and you're still here, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit subscribe. You'll get more of this. That's genuinely it. No filler, no fluff. Just stories worth your time. The second reason for the comeback is Boeing. Specifically, the Boeing 77X, the aircraft that was supposed to make the A380 irrelevant. The 77X was designed to be everything airlines wanted as an A380 alternative: comparable long-haul capacity, twin-engine fuel efficiency, modern avionics, superior per-seat economics. Airlines that announced A380 retirements around 2019 often did so with the 77X explicitly in mind as the replacement. Originally scheduled to enter service in 2020, the 77X has experienced a cascade of delays driven by structural concerns, certification issues, engine reliability problems. As of mid-2026, the aircraft is not expected to enter commercial service before 2027 at the earliest, and that timeline remains uncertain. Lufthansa was waiting for the 77X. Qatar Airways was waiting for the 77X. Several other carriers had structured their fleet retirement plans around its arrival. And it simply hasn't arrived. So the A380, the aircraft they'd retired, the aircraft they'd called a mistake, is now the only tool available for the job they need done. Not because it's ideal, because the ideal option hasn't shown up yet, and the routes are running regardless. The third reason is one that most coverage misses entirely, but it's arguably the most structurally significant. The slot problem at major hubs has gotten worse. Heathrow operates at over 98% capacity. Frankfurt, Dubai, Tokyo Narita all running near their physical limits. And unlike aircraft manufacturers, airports can't simply decide to build more capacity quickly. Planning permissions take years, terminal expansions cost billions, runway additions can take decades and still fail. Airbus built the A380 on the premise that the world would eventually need to concentrate more passengers onto fewer flights because airport infrastructure couldn't expand fast enough to accommodate individual point-to-point routes at scale. That prediction was in many ways too early. The hub congestion problem wasn't acute enough in 2007 to make the A380's economics work consistently. In 2026, it's becoming acute. And in that environment, the aircraft's fundamental proposition, 500 passengers on a single slot, spreading the cost of that slot across the maximum possible number of fare-paying travelers, becomes genuinely compelling again.
Now, here is where I want to be honest with you, because I think a lot of the coverage around the A380's comeback is more celebratory than it should be. The retrofit investments are real. The demand is real. The premium shift is real. The 777X delay is real. But there are questions worth asking that don't get enough attention. First, the maintenance problem. The A380 runs on 4 engines. Every other comparable long-haul aircraft in production today, the 787, the A350, the A330neo, runs on 2. 4-engine maintenance isn't just twice the cost of 2-engine maintenance. It's more than twice, because you're managing twice the number of engine-specific supply chains, spare parts inventories, and technician certifications. The 2-engine options for the A380, the Rolls-Royce Trent 9000 and the Engine Alliance GP 7200, are not interchangeable across fleets. As the global A380 fleet shrinks from its peak, both Rolls-Royce and the Engine Alliance face declining demand for parts and support services. Supply chains get thinner, turnaround times for overhauls get longer, costs per engine cycle go up. This isn't theoretical. It's the same economic pressure that retired the Boeing 747 and the MD-11. The gradual, quiet strangulation of a 4-engine type's parts ecosystem as fleet numbers decline past a certain threshold. Second, the environmental pressure. This is 2026. The EU emissions scheme covers intra-European flights and is expanding. CORSIA, the international carbon offsetting framework for aviation, is tightening. SAF mandates are increasing across multiple jurisdictions. Airlines have made net zero commitments with specific timelines attached to them. The A380 burns more fuel per flight than a 787 or A350 on a per-aircraft basis. On a per-seat basis, when it's full, the numbers are more competitive. But regulators and investors aren't necessarily thinking in per-seat terms. They're thinking in per-flight emissions, fleet averages, and carbon intensity metrics. For European carriers in particular, Lufthansa, Air France, the regulatory environment over the next decade is going to make the 4-engine, high-consumption A380 increasingly difficult to justify, regardless of what the passenger economics say. Third, and this is the one I find most interesting, the second-hand market still doesn't exist. Usually, when an aircraft type becomes uneconomical for passenger operations, airlines sell it to freight operators or lesser companies. The aircraft generates residual value for years after its passenger career ends. The 747 did this. The 777-200 is doing it. It's a normal part of the aircraft life cycle. The A380 has no freight future. Its airframe is so heavy that it runs out of lifting capacity before it can fill its cargo hold profitably. No dedicated freight operator has ever shown serious interest in converting it. And with only 251 aircraft ever built and 14 operators, the secondary market is thin to the point of non-existence. What that means practically
is that when an A380 ends its commercial passenger life, the value essentially goes to zero. Airlines own an asset with no exit. Parting out the aircraft for components is an option, but the returns are limited relative to the original capital cost. Here is what I actually think is happening. The A380's comeback is real, but it's uneven. For Emirates, which was always the only airline that could make the economics work consistently, the A380 will remain a genuine strategic asset for probably another 10 to 15 years, and the $2 billion retrofit reflects a sincere long-term commitment. For almost everyone else, the A380 is a bridge. It's filling a capacity gap that opened because travel recovered faster than expected, and because Boeing's replacement hasn't materialized. It's solving a premium cabin problem that airlines hadn't fully anticipated, and it's making use of assets that were already paid for rather than ordering new aircraft at today's elevated prices. But the moment the 777X enters service genuinely, reliably, in volume, the calculus for most non-Emirates operators will shift. The incremental fuel efficiency savings, the lower maintenance burden, the two-engine operating simplicity, and the cleaner environmental profile will start to look very attractive again. The A380 isn't dying, but for most airlines, it isn't becoming permanent either. It is, perhaps most accurately, the aircraft that was built for the wrong future and has found itself temporarily useful in a future nobody quite planned for.
The A380 was born from ambition that outran evidence. It was built to solve a problem that was real but arrived too early. It was nearly killed by a pandemic that killed everything, and it survived, unexpectedly, stubbornly, not because the original business case was vindicated, but because the world changed in ways that made its particular combination of size, space, and passenger experience temporarily, genuinely needed. Whether that's a comeback story or an epilogue dressed up as a comeback, I genuinely believe that depends on which airline you're talking about and on what Boeing does in the next 24 months. What I know for certain is this: the passengers love it. They always have. The quiet, the space, the sense of flying on something that takes the whole thing seriously, that experience is real and it's rare. And maybe that's worth something even in a spreadsheet world. The A380 refused to die. Whether the world will let it live, that's still being decided. If you made it this far, genuinely, thank you. This took a long time to put together, and it means a lot that you stayed with it. If you're not subscribed yet, hit the button now. I make videos like this regularly, and you won't want to miss the next one. And right there on your screen, there's a playlist of other deep dives just like this one. Stories about the aircraft, airlines, and decisions that shaped the world you fly through every time you travel. Click on it now. I promise you'll find something in there worth your next hour. See you in the next one.